This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin with our cattle market update for the week, provided by K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn shares that the market's held fairly steady in the last week and encourages producers to focus on the things they can control during such challenging economic times. Also ahead, K-State graduate student studying food microbiology and safety, Erin Manville, joins us to share insight on her research characterizing E. coli and irrigation found in Kansas. She shares everything she learned, including the importance of water testing, how easily E. coli can be spread, and the prevalence of antimicrobial-resistant E. coli in our water sources. We end with this week's wildlife segment where K-State aquatics and fisheries specialist Joe Gerken talks all things trout fishing. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're starting the week with our cattle market update. And joining us for that this week is Glynn Tonsor. He's a K-State livestock economist. So, Glynn, thanks for joining us.
Yep, happy to be on, Samantha.
Absolutely. So let's start as we always do. Same old, same old. What did cash markets hold this past week?
So cash cattle, AMS called through Thursday steady at $150 for the fed cattle market. We flip over to feeder cattle. It was $2 to $6 higher depending on what weight class I might quote you. I always like to bring a couple of the larger head lot examples. So 129 head, weighing 523, went for $199 and change, so just under $2, or $200 for 100 weight. 186 head lot, weighing 761, came in at $179. Both those two lots would have been up $3 to $5 themselves. How does that round out with the board? So the CME contracts, December live cattle was $152 at the close on Friday. That's down about $1 on the week. And then November feeder cattle was flat at $178 on the week. So if I pause right there, not a lot of change. I'm going to interject is I got wet coming over to do this. I think you spell that R-A-I-N. The cattle markets won't directly respond to that, but our listeners will care about that, right? So a lot of Kansas got some rain. So even if it was a ho-hum week in the market, it was a welcome week on the moisture front here in Kansas.
Yes, as we are recording this, there is that, that random stuff falling from the sky. I forgot what that felt like.
I almost had to look up how to spell it, but it is R-A-I-N. And I'm not trying to make too light of it. It is a serious issue, but it is nice we got some rain.
Yes, yeah, we are certainly happy we got that rain, and kind of sad for the folks out west that were expecting to get this rain, and we ended up with it. But nonetheless, we will take what we can get.
That's correct.
You mentioned, steady, relatively boring week, but in terms of box beef, anything interesting there?
Yeah, up a little bit more. So choice through Thursday was $265, up from about $262, so $3 higher on compared to the prior Thursday. And then select, not as much. So select was up $1, $233 versus $232. Anytime you see choice go up more than select, it's possible that's a demand signal. It's also possible that we have a relative supply chain, so don't overreact to that. But I'm highlighting that because we're going to get into meat demand monitor and so forth, is we are definitely, kind of past the tipping point on the supplies are going to be tightening. We need to watch demand, see what the net of just how much higher prices can go. Fed and feeder cattle prices are certainly up compared to a year ago. I'm very much tracking that. But exactly how far they're able to go is going to be dictated more by demand than supply because we definitely have tighter supply coming. So it's good to see that choice led select in the cutout numbers this past week. You look at processing, just as a quick update there. The initial estimates were 667,000 head of cattle through Saturday. These will be confirmed, revised 2 weeks out. But that compares last year was 652 and last week 668. So we are still running heavy volumes. Year to date is up 1.6%. But again, the cattle on feed numbers leading us towards lower numbers as this year completes itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Slowly seeing that decline happen over time. And like you said, probably more rapidly we'll see those coming soon.
That is the expectation. And, LMIC is often on this series as well. And, their numbers point to 5, maybe 6% year-over-year declines in cattle slaughter the next 2 years, even larger 2 years out. That's a component of, that's just number of hooves, right? So even with an increase in dressed weights, that means less beef on the market. So understanding exactly what the processing status is getting us current, but we expect those numbers to come down. We've been watching them because of pandemic disruptions, but they're dictated by the number of animals to start with, and the number of animals that are possibly going to show up in these plants is coming down.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this earlier, the meat demand monitor. So what did the results of October kind of show?
Yeah, so October had some continuation of the September story. but magnified. That'd be the summary statement before I go further. The magnified would be as price sensitivity is growing. But when we look at retail side, so think grocery store for at-home meat demand, each of the protein categories we looked at were up. So compared to September, that is. Ribeye steak, ground beef, pork chop, bacon, chicken breast, go down the line. All of them we'll be watching that effort were up compared to the prior month, but they're still down compared to October of 2021. So year-over-year decline, but month-over-month gain. So don't overreact to the gains is the way to interpret that. In my notes here, I called out the beans and rice category, and I'm well aware this is a meat and livestock arena, but we include the beans and rice as an alternative product you can buy. It is a source of protein, and it is, routinely a cheaper option. And it's not surprising to me that in the month of October, we estimate a spike in the demand for that. I think that is a signal that even though retail demand went up, people going to the grocery store are trying to cheapen up their basket because their wages aren't keeping up the cost of living is basically what's going on there. That has to be monitored. So ongoing inflation-oriented pressure is confirmed, again, in this MDM. I'm going to highlight that 3 or 4 times before we're done here today. The food service side of this, so away from home demand, all the protein categories we look at, so again, hamburger demand, ribeye steak demand, pork chops, so forth, they were down both month over month and year over year. And I think, again, this is an example of people tightening their belt. If you have a fixed, food budget, it's a little bit cheaper. All else equal to eat those calories at home if you'll prepare them. So that's what we're seeing going on.
Yeah, that shift from eating out to eating at home. But then, like you said, even from those people eating at home, shifting to cheaper alternatives like rice and beans.
Correct. Yeah, It's economics at work. And, I always interject here, and I didn't put this on my notes, but the self-declared diet, people saying if they're a regular meat consumer and, where high protein fits in their diet, so forth, those measures we have are still strong. And I'm interjecting that because I don't think we have a signal that people are trying to get away from meat protein. And this is an important distinction. I think it is a wallet squeeze. So wages aren't keeping up. So to the extent they can, they want to pay up and keep meat protein in. And they're doing some trading down and so forth, which, again, shows up in the MDM this month. That's important. That's different than in the past, not during the time period of the MDM, but in past decades, there's been multi-year periods, particularly for the beef sector, that's been demand weakness, and that's a much bigger challenge for the industry. I don't think that's what's going on here because fundamentally people want to keep beef and pork and chicken to be complete here in their diet. They're just going through a price-wage squeeze.
Yeah, the preference is still there, like you said, just having to make decisions that aren't as fun to be making right now.
Yeah, and the reason I'm trying to make that clarification is, A, to synthesize this report, but also because we track what we call protein values. So I ask each respondent, and for our listeners, all this is on Ag Manager, over 2,000 people every month are surveyed in this MDM effort, which is beef and pork checkoff funded, so it's all there and fully transparent. But we ask each of those over 2,000 people, what drives your protein purchasing decision? And I give them a list of 12 things. So taste, freshness, price, safety, that's 4 of the 12. And I'm highlighting those 4 because they regularly show up as the most important. But I'm not letting you tell me everything's important. It's a forced choice. So of these 12, which are the 4 most important and which are the 4 least important, which implies the 4 that are intermediate. So I know which of the 3 buckets each of the 12 kind of go in. The reason I'm spending extra time on this with you, Samantha, is price shows up as a top 4 consideration at the highest level in our data series. So this project started in February of 20. Since February of 20, October of 22 set a record for the percentage that put price in the top bucket.
Wow.
So price is growing in importance, and this is not unique to the meat category, but we're sitting here honing in on meat and demand and so forth. So price sensitivity is growing, is really what I'm trying to drive home. And that's mainly driven by things outside of the meat complex and the livestock complex. It's a broader macroeconomic story that impacts the meat and livestock sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because, like you said, you started collecting this data in February of 2020 when people at that time we thought were like, oh, this is an economic issue that we're all facing. Not only is it an issue health-wise, but it's affecting people's jobs and things like that. And we're seeing even higher concern with that now.
Yeah, and we had the stay-at-home orders and so forth. And, there's plenty of uncertainty in our world today, but I would argue there was more of it in 2020 in a lot of ways is what you're alluding to, and I would agree. But something that is different is real wages. And what I mean by real wages is how far does your nominal paycheck go and what you buy. Real wages are down. That was not the case early in 2020.
Sure.
So, and I'm not making a political statement. We don't need to go there. This is just a difference in time. Is when you have 6 to 10% inflation, depending on whose number you use, things are different than if you have, we actually had negative at one point, but more common, we had 2 to 4%, in the pre-pandemic arena and early in the pandemic. That changes things a lot. So unless your wages are going up by 8%, you're not keeping up, basically.
Yeah, which is not happening, obviously.
For most households, that is not occurring. That's
yes.
correct.
So you mentioned inflation there. That's obviously going to be a trend that we see continuing probably in the future, is just that continuing to increase, right?
Well, that's one of the million-dollar questions, given a lot of presentations in the last 3 months on the topic of what is inflation doing to the meat and livestock sector and even more narrowly consumers. And I literally start some of those talks with a picture of $1 million bill, which, by the way, doesn't exist, but it just gets everybody's attention because it's $1 million question. That's why I'm interjecting it here. I'm not Nostradamus. I don't know how long we'll have elevated inflation. And these are domestic comments. Components of this occur around the world, too. Many central banks are attempting to get inflation under control. Hopefully that is accomplished, but I'm not sitting here telling you it's going to anytime soon. Some resources that you can find on our agmanager.info website. Go to the contributors tab, find my name, and reverse chronological order our postings. So, for example, the October Meat Demand Monitor I just talked, you can find it. But if you go through that, you'll find some presentations that have inflation in the title. I've given 3 or 4 of those in recent, like the last 6 weeks for the pork industry in particular, that give some insights into work that I've actually done with Jason Lusk, colleague at Purdue University. We've done some work with the National Pork Board. Consumer sensitivity to prices growing. I noted that in the MDM. We actually find it in scanner data when we do a deeper, geeky econometric assessment of pork purchasing behavior. So consumers are more sensitive to price in their pork purchasing decisions. That's a general statement. It's even more evident in the loin complex than, say, bacon. So remember, not all pork is equal. We have different cuts. Different people, different economic situations are behind those products. I'm interjecting that here because, I want to make sure people know those resources are there. But there's a lot of interest in how people are adapting, and I'm honing in on the consumers, but even producers are adapting, right? So, we can talk about that if you like, but there's a lot of interest in what is the impact on inflation and where's it going forward. And I'm not Nostradamus. I don't know when it's coming down. No one of our listeners can influence inflation on their own, but you certainly got to be aware of the impacts. And I hope those resources on Ag Manager help folks.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned producers reacting to inflation too. Obviously, our grain markets are quite chaotic right now, just with drought going on and then other social aspects going globally, I feel like, are even contributing to what we see locally in our cash markets, things like that. So we're seeing that pay off with producers too, right? Yeah,
there's a lot of challenges and uncertainty. I've been ending some of those same talks with a phrase, be aware of global issues. So educate yourself. I read The Economist magazine, things like that, broaden your horizon if you like. So be aware of bigger issues. Maybe a specific example is, it is good if you are, this is a grain commentary more than a livestock comment, but if you find yourself trying to, market grain right now, it's good to know the challenges of the Mississippi River. I'll just pause there. It has implications for basis you're seeing and ability to store and ability to move out of the country. But you can't control exactly how much water is in the lower Mississippi, right? That's beyond any of our abilities. Shout out back to the earlier comment about it's good to have some rain. We need more of that to help with those issues. Yeah. But you ultimately have to manage locally. So things that are on your ranch or your farm that you can influence, you can make changes to feed efficiency in your feed yard, or maybe you can change the seed you put in the ground, right? There's different things you do have some influence on, but you're not going to change the water in the Mississippi or the inflation rate and those kind of things. And that's not easy to accept. So there's a distinction between being aware of forces that are impacting you and honing in on the things that you can influence. And at the end of the day, I encourage folks to make that important distinction and then hone in on the things they can influence, because that's where their managerial ability can actually pay off.
Yeah, put that energy where it can actually be useful instead of worrying about the big picture things like you mentioned. I feel like if I could control the Mississippi River, I'd be a very rich gal.
You would be. You probably wouldn't bother talking to folks like me if you could do that.
No, that's not true. Come on, Glenn. Anyways, Glenn, as always, I am so thankful for your time and for sharing all the information you share with our listeners. So thank you once again.
Thanks for having me on, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, that was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor for this week's cattle market update. We'll be back with more on this Monday's program ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with a graduate student here at K-State. Her name is Erin Manville. She's a master's student studying food science, but focusing specifically on food microbiology and food safety. So, Erin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, you recently defended your thesis.
Yes.
Congratulations, first and foremost.
Yes. We are done.
Such a great feeling. But your research really focused on characterizing E. coli in irrigation. Wow, what an important topic.
Yeah, no, it really is. It's very, very prevalent, especially with a lot of those regulations now put on agricultural water. So we just wanted to understand what is in the water, what E. coli is in the water. Is it concerning? Is it not concerning? How are those routes of contamination? What is there is more or less what we were trying to understand. What kind of E. coli is there?
Absolutely. So you partnered with a few, I think it was vegetable producers across the state that were in smaller underrepresented groups?
Yes. I worked with underrepresented farmers. So Mennonite farms, Amish farms, and small produce growers. So it was great. I got to go to those farms and meet them and sample their water and talk to them about their water safety. So yeah, it was lots of different farmers that we were able to work with, which is great.
Absolutely. And with a lot of different farmers you were interacting with, lots of different forms of water sources. So what were some of the ones you looked at?
Yeah. So within the parameters of the project, our main focus was surface water, so we did a lot of pond sampling, but we also did cisterns, which I think most people know what a cistern is. It collects rainwater, and then we did some wells too. So found some really interesting results regarding that. So usually I guess people think that those groundwater sources are a lot safer than your surface water just because they're not exposed to the environment, but we did get a lot of E. coli from those groundwater sources. So it's something to look at and be aware of when you're using maybe a well for your irrigation too. It also could be concerning for E. coli.
Yeah, absolutely. A risk to be wary of for sure. And we'll talk about the importance of testing here in a moment. But getting back to your research, you looked at some of the genetics of the E. coli that you were sampling. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I did whole genome sequencing. So that is more or less just taking the whole genetic code of that bacteria and making it data. And once it's data, I can kind of take out pieces and understand what their virulent factors are. So those are, I guess, part of that host pathogen interaction. So will it make us sick? And then I looked at those antimicrobial resistant genes. And those, are they resistant to penicillin or tetracycline, things along those lines, or these bacteria? And then I did serotyping, which is also another distinct characteristic for that host pathogen interaction. So how they attack the host, these are very specific characteristics. And then I did source tracking. So I wanted to identify where this E. coli originated. So did it come from a cow? Was it just dwelling in the soil? Did it come from a pig? Things of that nature. So we kind of understand how that water is getting contaminated or where that E. coli, the routes of contamination for that E. coli.
Yeah, absolutely. So, understanding the source maybe helps it easier to prevent in the future.
Yes. So I guess an example, so a lot of the water sources that I was sampling from, so ponds, they were fenced in areas and they didn't have access to, like domestic animals didn't have access to that water, but we were still finding E. coli that was from cattle or from sheep or goats. And a lot of those farms had those animals on that farm. So it just kind of shows you that, okay, a deer could be running through your cattle field and then it goes directly to that water source and it can either walk through that water source or it could defecate near that water source and that could also contaminate that water. Or your dogs running around, running through fields could run and contaminate that water. So just because there's not direct exposure, those animals aren't, I guess, directly exposed to that water source doesn't mean that E. coli from that animal is not getting into that water source.
Good to understand for sure. I mean, a lot of people, like you said, fenced off, so out of sight, out of mind, you would think, but obviously not the case for a lot of these situations.
Yeah, a lot of animals can just carry. They're asymptomatic carriers. So again, those ones that are of pathogenic concern to us reside naturally in cattle or those ruminants. So other animals are usually just asymptomatic carriers or they can carry it on their body more or less. And so that's kind of how it can get transported. Also, I guess if you're working, so say you have a dirt road right next to your water source. If a car or a Jeep or whatever you're using to go through your field and you drive on that, there's now residual feces in that dirt road. And then when it's really, really dry and there's dust flying everywhere, that dust can transport into that water system too. So yeah, just different factors that really opened my eyes to there are way more ways that water or these E. coli can get into that water source than I was really aware of when I first started this project. And so it's been very interesting.
Absolutely. This year, a strong year for dust, being that it's been so dry with the drought.
Yeah.
So, an interesting way to think about it. And in terms of some of the genetics we're looking at, you mentioned kind of those ones that were a little bit resistant to antibiotics. What did you find there?
Yeah. So I mentioned penicillin and tetracycline. So Those are 3 different genes for that antimicrobial resistance, and those were the most prevalent that were observed from all of the E. coli that we collected through that water source. And a lot of those antibiotics were once used very readily in livestock. And so it kind of shows the cause and effect of heavily using antibiotics in your livestock. I don't know what the uses of antibiotics in livestock are now. I'm not familiar with that, but I know at one point these were really well used or used frequently. And so it changes their gut microbiota. And so those E. coli that survived the initial dose of those antibiotics now have established a resistance and a way to combat that antibiotic. And then that gets shed in their feces, and then that can spread to all the other bacteria through various modes, right? And all of the E. coli, I think I found 191 isolates of E. coli, which isn't a lot, but like it's a good amount of data that we were working with. And every single one of them had some gene for antimicrobial resistance. So it's very, very prevalent, and it's everywhere. So it does spread. It is something to be, I guess, aware of when using your antibiotics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've learned so much more about antibiotic-resistant bacteria and things like that, to where cattle producers today do have some of these veterinary feed directives that they have to follow a bit more closely to prevent things like that from continuing to happen, because it's so prevalent. And obviously, the research you've done has shown how it's played out. So that's crazy to see on paper.
Yeah, no, it was a lot to see on paper. I was like, oh, this is very real. Water sources are also, I guess, an opportunistic environment for bacteria to kind of share genetic material. So they can also share those virulent factors. So how they attack their host can also be passed on to a different bacteria that's in the area. Because again, water is moving around, so all the bacteria is constantly getting mixed up and mingling with other bacteria. So if someone has, say, penicillin resistance, it could pass it on to another one that doesn't have penicillin resistance. And yeah, it kind of creates a very hardy and resistant and virulent community of cells.
Especially when a producer isn't testing, potentially.
Yes, please test your water.
Yeah, if it's an ongoing issue that's just accumulating over time. So a good reminder for that.
Yeah, so K-State, I know that the Olathe campus and the Manhattan campus does free water testing for produce growers. So capitalize on that, because I don't know how much longer they're going to be doing it. But yes, take advantage of that as an opportunity, so you kind of understand what risks your irrigation water could be, so that you can properly mitigate those or understand how to reduce those levels, whether that be moving animals, building a fence, or applying some chemical to your pond. Or I guess, whatever you're working with. But yeah, take advantage of the water testing. It just looks for your generic E. coli, which is your indicator for those pathogenic strains of concern.
Sure, and that process fairly simple to go through?
Yeah, it is. It's actually very, very simple. I literally did one before I walked over here. It takes 10 minutes on my end, so not painful in any way, shape, or form. You can definitely go on the K-State website, and there's a whole section on water testing, so you can get all that information and reach out. You'll probably end up calling me or someone in Olathe, but usually me. So, yes.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll link to that in the show notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net as always. But Erin, in terms of major takeaways that you are carrying with you into the future that you learned through this research, what are they?
Aside from just learning more about the genetic makeup of E. coli, which was very, very interesting, one, I think the big thing is those sources of water that are concerning. I just assumed that surface water was the biggest threat. That's not necessarily true. Those groundwater sources are also concerning. And then I don't know, it gave me a different perspective on those routes of contamination. So, for example, the cistern that we did a lot of sampling on, it was within someone's house, and it had not kind of their house, but it was in a shed-ish area, and it had a big stone covering on it. And we found very high rates of E. coli. So, I mean, whether that be, I guess, bird feces that was on the roof and it was running through that water when it rained, or when people would shuffle in from working and whatever was on their boots landed in that water system, it's just, I don't know, it gave me a different perspective on your routes of contamination and how, I guess, the lasting effects of dirt just getting brushed into things and what's residing in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a case for biosecurity.
Yeah. Something definitely to be aware of. Change your shoes before you walk into water.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Erin, I can't thank you enough for your time today. I think this is such an interesting area of research. If listeners are tuning in and they're looking for more information about E. coli and irrigation, do you know of any great resources for them?
Definitely start on the website, the K-State website, for your water sampling. I know that there is a lot of resources with the extension community because I was able to work really closely with a lot of them, and they're all very, very knowledgeable and eager to help. So definitely reach out to your K-State extension people. I learned a lot about water and what they do through this project too. So that is, I think, what I would suggest for that.
Absolutely. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time today, Erin, and congratulations again.
Yeah, thank you. We're done. Woo!
Once again, that was Erin Manville. She is a master's student studying food science here at K-State, speaking to characterizing E. coli and irrigation. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Ag Today intern Malia Walker. Joining us now in studio is Fisheries and Aquatic Extension Specialist Joe Gerken for our weekly wildlife segment. So, Joe, thanks for joining us once again.
Excited to chat with you today.
So today we're going to be talking about trout. As of November 1st, we got into trout season here in Kansas. So Kansas has a trout season.
Yeah, so Kansas has an open trout fishery from November 1st through April 15th every year. There's about 35 sites in Kansas that are part of this program. So opportunities to get out and catch some mostly rainbow trout in Kansas lakes.
As I understand, trout are not originally from Kansas, so how did they get here, and where exactly can you find them here in Kansas?
So there are about 35 sites located throughout the state. Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks purchases fish from a hatchery and then stocks them into lakes, and so they do that generally around the end of October. They like cold streams with a lot of oxygen, and so that's not typically a Kansas environment, but KDWP wanted to have another opportunity for a fishery, so they stock these fish into these lakes to give you that opportunity to catch some of these trout.
Yeah, so you mentioned rainbow trout. Is that the only trout around here in Kansas that's stocked?
Yep, so primarily the rainbow trout is what's stocked in Kansas. We have had some previous stocking events where they've stocked brown trout to try to have some opportunities to catch some bigger trophy-sized fish. Brown trout can get bigger, so that's primarily down in southeast Kansas. There's a mining pit that's really deep where the trout can live year-round. But for the most part, if you go trout fishing in Kansas, you're going to be catching rainbow trout.
And you mentioned they like cold water, and so is that why the season concludes in April?
Yep, the trout can only survive in cold water, and really the limiting factor is they need a lot of oxygen in their water. Warmer water holds less oxygen than colder water. So, if you think about a trout system, typically they're living in a stream that's getting all rumbled up, and so there's a lot of oxygen in that water. So that's what they need to thrive and survive. As the temperatures warm up in these systems, the amount of oxygen dwindles, and so the fish won't survive the warmer months in Kansas. So that's why the season comes to an end in April. There's just not a lot of fishing opportunities once the water temperatures tend to warm up.
So I'm very unfamiliar when it comes to seasons for fishing. Do you need a special permit?
Yep. So there are two things that you need, or most people need to fish. And so if you're fishing for trout, you need a trout permit, and that's required for fishing. That is a $7 permit if you're 15 years or under, and it's $14.50 for everyone that is over 16 years of age. So everyone fishing for trout in Kansas needs to make sure they have that permit. If you're between the ages of 16 and 74, you also need to make sure that you have a valid fishing license. So if you're going out, make sure that you're purchasing those licenses, following the law, being safe, following all the requirements. There's also limits a lot of times. So in most of these lakes, the limit is 5 fish per day. Some lakes have different total catch limits. So you want to make sure that you look up those regulations before you go and have an opportunity to enjoy the fishery and do it the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you have any secret tips to catching trout?
Everyone always wants to know how to cheat. So most of these trout are raised in a hatchery, so they're used to eating food that's thrown in every single day. And so that means that a lot of times it's a fairly easy or fun way to get out and get involved in catching some trout. It's a great opportunity to get out and fly fish. There aren't many fly fishing opportunities in Kansas. Having said that, you can catch a lot of different species in Kansas with fly fishing, but it's really a unique opportunity to get out and use some fly fishing techniques. A lot of people use corn. Night crawlers are really popular. The best thing I would recommend is go to the local bait shop. Chat up with those people. They're out in that area. They're going to kind of know what's working for these trout. They're going to want to help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. So if listeners are tuning in and want to find some more resources and information on trout fishing, where can they go?
So like I said, starting with your local bait shop is a great place. Your local extension agent might have some advice for you. Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, KDWP, has a lot of resources online that you can go just search for trout fishing, and they can definitely point you in the right direction. So if all else fails, you can reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you out with any pointers that I know.
All right, Joe, thank you again for joining us and telling us a little bit about trout season. Once again, that was Fisheries and Aquatic Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. I'm Malia Walker, and this has been Agriculture Today.